further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Amy Forrester, who is a children's librarian at Denver Public Library, and Sarah Dutel, who is a children's collection specialist at the Denver Public Library. And I am going to let them go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Christine. This is Amy here, and I am doing my first webinar today, so I'm excited. We're going to talk quickly about our learning objectives for today. By the end of today's webinar, we hope that you'll be able to articulate the impact of third grade literacy, explore ways collections can support third grade literacy, explain the 5 grade level reading skills, and increase discoverability of developing reader materials at your library to better support kindergarten through 3rd grade readers and their caregivers. Before we dive any deeper into today's webinar, we wanted to take a moment to introduce ourselves and
Hi everyone, this is Sarah. So it's my responsibility as the Children's Collection Specialist to select and purchase all of the juvenile and teen materials for all 26 of the Denver Public Library locations. So I use my many years of experience as a frontline children's librarian to inform those purchases, as well as to help me decide in which.
And this is Amy again. As a children's librarian, I'm very much informed by my experiences working on the front lines with customers. I've served on the Geisel Award Committee, an ALA ALSC Beginning Reader Book Award, and I co-host a mock blog about the award as well. And finally, as a member of DPL's grade level reading project team, I've been involved in
Amy and I have worked on a number of projects together over the years, and we found that our experiences, passions, and knowledge really are a great complement with each other. Plus, we really just love to work together, so that's why we're doing this today.
This is true. So to get us started today, we're going to use the pods to share details about purchasing and selecting duties that you have in your current position. So you're going to see 3 pods in front of you. In the first, we're asking about your selecting and purchasing responsibilities. In the second, how collection development is done at your library. And in the third pod, whether or not your collection floats. And to be clear, floating collections don't have a home base. Items stay at whichever location they're returned at. So for some context, Denver Public Library, our collection floats. And I, as a children's librarian, I can recommend what I would like to have purchased to Sarah, but I don't do the actual purchasing because we have that centralized for us here. So let's see. Got a lot of people with floating collections and a lot of people with recommending powers. I like to call them powers.
They're definitely powers. I like to see that there are so many people out there that are empowered to do the recommending.
And Emily noted in the chat that part of their collection floats and parts do not, so that is another possibility.
Oh, interesting.
That's really fascinating. I would love to learn more about that sometime, Emily. Spend a minute or 2 more on this before we move on. It really does seem like collection development is moving towards a more centralized system. Is that something that you're seeing as a trend, Sarah?
You know, when I talk with other people, it does seem like it tends to be more centralized, unless there's, subject specialists somewhere that are specifically responsible for things.
Okay. Oh, it looks like
Yes,
part of a
it does look
collection
like
floats.
the big majority is centralized.
Okay, yeah. And then it looks like Diana's saying that at her library, part of their collection floats as well. Great. Well, I'm going to move on in the interest of time. So, why should we focus on developing readers, or what we at Denver Public Library call grade level reading? For the grade level reading GLR project team, this heat map from the Status of Denver's Children report has been our constant companion. On this map, the darker the shade of orange, the more students there are in the neighborhood not reading at grade level. And according to a recent Chalkbeat article, just 26 out of 178 Colorado districts had more than half of their third graders reading at grade level. So in other words, in Colorado, 40% of third graders are reading at grade level. And in Denver, that number is a little lower at 39.4%, which are just staggering and horrible numbers. And we know that the ability to read is a foundation that students need in order to navigate future grades and life after school. The Denver Office of Children's Affairs states that beginning in 4th grade, children transition from learning how to read to reading to learn. And so in response to this, DPL put together an internal work team to look at what our role could be in supporting developing readers. At the public library, it's not our MO to limit children or our collection by reading level. So what does this mean for us to support this work? After lots of research and discussion, the GLR project team came up with this project mission: to support and empower library staff, families, and educators to connect children, kindergarten through 3rd grade, with diverse books they enjoy and that inspire curiosity to foster lifelong readers. In our meetings with Denver Public Schools, we heard a clearly articulated need for DPL to focus on the joy of reading rather than the nuts and bolts of learning to read. And that really made sense to us because library employees aren't trained to teach people to read, but we are trained to connect readers with materials that match their interests and reading levels. And we really see this as an extension of our early literacy and Every Child Ready to Read ECRR work, where we serve children from birth to 5 years old, and their parents and caregivers. So this grade level reading is an intentional bit. It's about the transition from ready to read to learning to read. And we want to ensure that library staff is just as confident serving and supporting kindergartners to 3rd graders in their reading journeys as they are serving younger children. All right, so before we even had a grade level reading project team, Sarah and I were talking about books for developing readers. And the more we talked, the more we realized that although many books for developing readers were cataloged in our beginning reader section, there were great titles shelved in nonfiction, picture books, graphic novels, and chapter books. And we knew we didn't want to move all of these titles to the beginning reader section. So the question became, how can we increase findability? How can we make it easier for caregivers and staff to find excellent, diverse books for readers in kindergarten through 3rd grade? And with this goal in mind, our cataloging, collection development, and children's library staff worked collaboratively to determine our project requirements. As I noted earlier, we have a floating collection, so whatever we decided to do had to be flexible enough to work at all of our locations. We knew we wanted to focus on access, but not at the expense of reader confidence. We didn't want to create any sort of stigma. We didn't want kids to feel like they were reading a baby book or that they could only select books from a certain section. And finally, we knew we didn't want to tie our method to any specific leveling system, and this was for a variety of reasons. First, Denver Public Schools empowers their 200+ schools to use any leveling system they like. And in fact, individual teachers are allowed to choose whatever system they prefer. So this means you could have a 1st grader and 3rd grader going to the same school, but using different leveling systems, which is super confusing. A second reason is that leveling systems are for profit, and so many titles are not leveled because it costs publishers to level a title. And finally, we know that no leveling system is perfect. I'm sure we all have thoughts on leveling systems. And the thing is that they don't necessarily align with publisher levels either. I'm not going to talk about all of that right now because Sarah will talk about that more later. So we had our goals and requirements, and they led us to this: subject headings. Technically, they're local subject heading points. This basically means we created them in-house locally. They weren't created by a vendor or given to us by the Library of Congress. And we landed on subject headings as a way to provide more access points for customers and staff. Subject headings meant no shelving changes, no stickers, and no stigma. These subject headings are searchable via the Online Public Access Catalog, or OPAC, as well as our staff side interface. And we use Polaris for our ILS if you're curious. And yes, subject headings plural because we created 2. The first subject heading is early books, and they support kids just beginning to read. And the second is transitional books that support kids bridging from early books to chapter books. And titles with these subject headings are chosen because all the elements, design, font, vocabulary, narrative complexity, illustrations, come together to support developing readers. We look for books that are great for pleasure reading, not things that we see as textbooks or what used to be called basal readers. The inclusion of titles with diverse representations has been a major consideration for us. That's another thing that I'm not going to go into right now because Sarah's going to talk about that later as well. I'm going to show you some examples of early books. Title and author information is included in the slide notes. And as you can see, titles include nonfiction, picture books, graphic novels, and beginning readers. And much of our work was putting together criteria for each of the subject headings. We based some of it on K.T. Horning's book, From Cover to Cover, as well as on the Geisel Award criteria. We wanted our criteria to be detailed enough to help us determine if a book was a good fit, but there also needed to be some wiggle room for informed judgment. So for instance, our criteria for early books includes a Lexile range of 0 to 350, which we found is usually about on target. However, if a title doesn't have a Lexile level or it fits all the other criteria except the Lexile level, we'll use our own informed judgments as librarians to decide what to do. And in the case of this example, it's pretty clearly on target. This has a Lexile level of 110. And we use Lexile because a lot of our information is pulled in from novelists, and they automatically pull in Lexile, so it's an easy reference point for us. We look for a large font that has ample white space between words, as well as a round text. And this helps the eye focus because we have to train our muscles to read. It's just like any other muscle we have in our bodies that we have to train it to read from left to right and to have stamina. And white space doesn't have to be white. It could be blue or green, or in this case, it's pink. The important thing is that it provides an uncluttered background to make the words stand out to readers. And here's another example. We look for sentences made up of no more than 12 short, just 1 or 2 syllables apiece words. It's best if those words repeat often, so readers have a chance to practice and gain confidence with them. And then simple punctuation is another important element for very new readers. Colons, semicolons, and my least favorite, ellipses, can be really confusing. So we look for that clarity to help support them. For early books, we want illustrations on every 2-page spread. That really helps readers by supporting the text. In this example, we have visual representations of you and I, big and small. And also illustrations are enticing and they promote reading motivation. They make a book exciting. You want to pick it up, right? And in case you're wondering, this is You're Not Small and it has a Lexile level of 60. So then here are some examples of wonderful transitional books. Again, you'll see we have beginning readers, early chapter books, graphic novels, and nonfiction. And here is an example that shows some of our criteria. As you might expect, criteria for transitional books allows for longer books with more text. In general, we're looking for books no longer than 100 pages, although we found that nonfiction titles are often much shorter. The font should still be large, though it doesn't need to be as large as the font we find in early books. And we want wide margins and white space, but as we can see in this example, it doesn't have to be as plentiful as in an early book. And here's a second example. Lexile-wise, we're looking at titles around 350 to 750. Fox and Chick, our example from the previous slide, comes in at 370, and this slide, Charlie and Mouse, is leveled at 420. Although not all transitional books have chapters, we have found it helpful to have a ballpark number of pages per chapter. So for context, chapters in Charlie and Mouse are between 6 and 12 pages, and Fox and Chick has longer chapters between 15 and 16 pages, but that really makes sense because it's a graphic novel. So it comes in around that 15-page mark. And finally, we want illustrations to provide occasional visual context clues and also help keep readers engaged, but they don't need to be on every page, as with an early book. Kids have a little more stamina by then. We also spent a good bit of time researching and discussing terms for our subject headings, and this slide shows some of the names that we discussed. We finally decided to go with early and transitional books for a couple of reasons. First, we felt they defined the book rather than the reader. And second, we wanted subject headings that would work for keyword and subject heading searches because we know our staff and customers use both types of searching. The terms early and transitional are specific enough that they don't bring back too many irrelevant results if you're just searching by keyword, which is really helpful. And finally, we felt that chapter book seemed a little confusing because some nonfiction and graphic novels don't have chapters. So we've got another interactive bit here. We are curious about where you shelve books for developing readers because there are great books for developing readers across many genres, and we want to know where you put those. You can use the check boxes to let us know. We have 3 genres: nonfiction, picture books, and graphic novels. I'll just take a moment to see as our votes come in. Let's see. We've got a lot of nonfiction interfiled with Dewey, though a not insignificant portion that it has a separate nonfiction beginning reader section. And then looks like picture books. Some of them are interfiled with beginning readers, which is interesting because of all of our different locations. They have different size shelves for books. And so Sarah and I have had lots of conversations about that and if that would work across the system with some of those larger trim size picture books.
And special size shelves.
Yes. If all our shelves could just be robotic and just move, it would be great. And then it looks like graphic novels are pretty evenly split. Some are interfiled with beginning readers, some interfiled with Dewey, and then separate graphic novel beginning reader section. If anybody clicks other and would like to type in the chat box what they do for other, we would be very curious to know how you do that.
It's interesting that the majority of people interfile their nonfiction with the Dewey, because I know we've had a lot of discussions at Denver Public Library about where to put those, and I I really push hard to keep them in Dewey, just for those readers that love to discover different topics. The kids that are really interested in dinosaurs or backhoes or road graders are going to find those readers there. But I definitely know that there are really strong reasons to put them elsewhere. So it's really interesting to see these numbers.
They are. It looks like Jessie says they have strict rules for their beginning readers. They have to be leveled to be classed and shelved as an easy reader. And Nancy says all of their graphic novels for developing readers are shelved with their other graphic novels so they keep formats together. And it looks like Diana does the same with their developing reader graphic novels. Let's see. Jessie says that books that don't have a level are put in with picture books or nonfiction, even if they really are best for beginning readers. And then Emily at Hennepin says they don't have a separate developing reader area except for easy readers. And all of their graphic novels are together. But they do a lot of displays. Yeah, I think displays are a nice way to build that connection between collections, to allow a moment for customers to ask questions and for staff to be able to show them new places to find what they're looking for. This is really fascinating. I love to look at data like this. So thank you all for sharing. So we also wanted to share our project timeline. Let me click to the next slide. I'm not going to read all of this right now. It's here in case you're curious, in case you wanted to do something similar. The important things to know are that we launched these subject headings in 2017, and we add titles biannually in May and December. As of our most recent update, we have identified 3,500 early books and just under 2,000 transitional book titles. And always looking for more. The subject headings are great, but they're really only useful if people know they exist. So our promotion plan targets customers and staff. We have a post on our website. Our kids' website is called Read, Play, Learn. And we include a link to that post when we create personalized reading lists for customers that include books for developing readers. Additional promotions include our bookmark with tips for searching using the OPAC, which helps both staff and customers remember those steps. And on the back side of that developing reader bookmark, we also have the 5-finger rule. The subject headings are also a big focus of our internal trainings, which include information and discussion about the elements of supportive books for developing readers, kind of like what we just did in that previous section. And then we post about the subject headings fairly regularly on our Children's Library Facebook. Thanks for posting all those links, Christine. As Emily was talking about, displays, don't forget those. Our marketing and communications department created a sort of logo for us, those two kids standing on the books. And any of our branches can request it in any size. We really love that we have that giant pillar sign. In addition, we created sticky notes with GLR tips to help customers know why a book is supportive. We've linked to the how-to. Oh, Christine's got the link right there. In case you want to print your own stickies, they're super easy to do on a regular printer. We love them a lot. So if you're interested in doing something similar at your library, here are a few things to keep in mind. First, in this specific case, we felt the stigma of a sticker or a new shelf location would create more obstacles than it would remove. However, in looking at your collection, you may decide that a sticker or a new shelving location better serves your community and your goals than a local subject heading. In many ways, stickers and shelving are more easily accessible for customers and staff. And that's because local subject headings require people know they exist in order to utilize them. They're not visually obvious as a sticker or a shelving location would be. So there's a bit of a learning curve as staff and customers become comfortable using them. In our case, we were okay with this trade-off, but it does mean that promoting the subject headings is essential to the success of the project. And speaking of success, how will you evaluate the success of your project? The size of our collection is constantly in flux as we add new items and delete old ones. So we use the ratio of items to circs as a stable method of measurement. However, you may find a better or more accurate method for your project. And that about wraps up my section. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Okay, so the diversity audit. Another piece of the puzzle in terms of what makes up our collection and how I do my own job in collection development is making sure that the collection that our kids in Denver have access to is as diverse in person and interest as they are. This is where the idea of a diversity audit came into play. In November of 2017, Amy and I took an online library journal class titled Diversity and Cultural Competency Training, Collections and RA. And as a part of that class, we were instructed to perform a diversity audit of a portion of our collection. That's to say, we were to look at a specific portion of our juvenile collection here at Denver Public Library and determine, based on some parameters that we came up with, just how much diversity was reflected on the pages. In short, we were attempting to discover how much of our collection reflected the diversity of the children in our city. The titles that we had already identified as part of our early and transitional books project seemed like an obvious choice and one that we wanted to work on together. I wanted more information to inform my purchasing decisions, and Amy wanted more information to help share out with staff that were doing Reader's Advisory. So, how did we tackle this huge project? Well, here's a sample of how we captured our data. We started with a master shelf list of all of the titles currently in the early and transitional categories, and then we whittled it down to just our beginning readers, the ones that were part of that collection here at DPL. because we felt that that would be a really helpful collection to look at, and then also something manageable to do with just the two of us. Next, we decided what we wanted to focus on. It was a really big project, and we had to be selective about what kind of diversity we were looking for, and really tried to focus on the types of diversity represented in Denver's demographics. So we took a look at Denver demographic statistics, and we filled in with Colorado and national stats where there were gaps. We've listed our data sources in the notes at the end of the presentation, so you can take a look at those. We chose to look at cultural representations and family structures, and then we also noted whether or not the title was own voices. This was a very time-consuming but worthwhile project. It was very time-consuming because we had to get our hands, eyes, and minds on each one of these books and then manually tally each area of representation, as you can see from the ones in the columns, so that Excel would add things up for us. We used our informed judgment and statistics to pick things that were age appropriate and relevant. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of the results of cultural representation, and I think for me this chart is just really impactful. When you think about wanting to make sure that every child has the opportunity to see themselves reflected in the pages of a story, and then you take a hard look at the actual collection, at those individual stories that the children are seeing, well, I guess the numbers here speak for themselves. So just to highlight one example, more than 55% of Denver's child population identifies as Latinx, but barely 2% of the early and less than 2.5% of the transitional readers in those categories have characters that reflect these kids back to themselves. That's really sad. In comparison, only 23% of Denver's child population identifies as white, whereas over 90% of the early books in the collection default to either white children, or animals, or inanimate objects, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. So here are the results in graph format of the cultural representation portion. For the sake of this project, we combined the books that depicted animals or inanimate objects as the main characters with those using white children as a default. If you choose to do a diversity audit for your collection, you might choose to separate these two categories out. We felt that there were many instances where the animals or inanimate objects seemed to be a stand-in for dominant culture, or a way of sidestepping any direct association with a specific cultural group. And as these books did nothing to further the goal of reflecting diversity in the collection beyond dominant culture, we decided that they could, in fact, be grouped together. Okay, some more results here. So just to pull the numbers out in a little bit different way, here you can see that in our early and transitional areas, and again, we're only talking about the beginning readers in each of these areas, those non-human protagonists really dominate the scene, with more than 55% for the early books and 44% for the transitionals. Why do we see so many in this category? Well, we really don't know for sure, but some of our guesses would be that they're cute, so the kids will be drawn to those illustrations. Maybe a safe choice, as it sidesteps the entire realm of cultural identity. They could be a stand-in for dominant culture without being overt. They might just be spin-offs of, say, television, Netflix, picture books, movies, chapter books, etc. And if we're really being honest here, it might just also be a result of the knowledge that books with non-human protagonists have a long-standing history of popularity and therefore a proven track record. So we've been looking at the results of a segment of Denver Public Library's juvenile collection, and while we're aware that we don't own every single title ever published, we feel that we do have a fairly comprehensive collection. Let's take it one step further now and look at the results of a much larger and more comprehensive survey performed by the Cooperative Children's Book Center, the CCBC, in 2015 and then again in 2018. Okay, I'm sure many of you have probably seen this slide before, but I think that these images are just so incredibly powerful. The study that was done by the CCBC in Madison, Wisconsin was published in 2016, and it was based on books for children birth through 14 that were published in the US in the year 2015. As you can see, the mirrors for anyone that wasn't white or non-human were awfully small. And the links for these pictures and the associated studies are available in the presentation. I really encourage you to come back when you have some time to look at the images and take some time to digest what you're seeing there. Okay, so let's fast forward 3 years. The We Need Diverse Books movement is starting to help change the picture. At a glance, things are starting to look a little different. You'll notice that some of the mirrors over on the left-hand side of the slide are a little larger than they were 3 years ago. However, there are a few things I'd like to point out here. Let's look at the animals and the white representation. The percentage of white representation went down from more than 73% in the last slide to 50%, whereas the animal depiction moved up from 12.5% to 27%. To me, this decrease in white representation but increase in animals reinforces this idea that animals are a stand-in for the dominant culture. The majority of titles published in English in the US still lands over on the right-hand side of this slide. You may notice that twice as many Latinx books were published in 2018. Sounds great, right? But when we're talking about it moving from 2.4% to 5%, there's still a long way to go. Now, let's take a closer look at the mirrors that the children on the left-hand side of the slide are holding. Do you see the cracks in the mirrors? The cracks are meant to represent the distortion of representation. That's to say that just because a character from an underrepresented group is present does not mean that their experience is accurately portrayed or reflected. For me and for many out there, this really begs the question: is it better to have representation, even if it's inaccurate, in order to at least have some representation in our collections? Or is it better for us not to have anything in our collections that does not reflect authentic experience, even if it means we have gaps of representation in our collections? This also leads to the question about how to determine authenticity of experience and representation. Who gets to say whether an experience or description is authentic? Add in the complicated fact that each person is an individual made up of so many intersecting pieces, and we can really start to see how complex these questions are. I struggle with all of this on the collection development end of things on a daily basis, as my colleagues can attest to. I do really want to highlight the last point as it relates to the diversity audit that we did here at DPL. We didn't assess for the quality of representation. We simply noted whether or not any diversity was present. We also didn't assess for stereotypes. When we hear the word stereotypes, many of us think of ideas that have a negative connotation, such as all people from such and such a place, culture, or generation are loud, lazy, unfriendly, whatever. Obviously, holding on to the idea that an entire group of people possesses the same so-called negative trait is a very harmful act. However, even the so-called positive beliefs about people, such as the idea that certain groups of people are thought of as smart or high achievers, can also be harmful. Basically, any time that we categorically apply a label to an entire group of people, we are negating people's individuality and perpetuating harmful ideas. And while we didn't assess for this in our diversity audit, I do really watch for both the so-called positive and negative stereotyping to be called out in reviews, and I do take that very seriously into account when I'm selecting for our collections. Okay, what did we do with our findings? So finally, doing a diversity audit or any kind of study really doesn't mean much unless you somehow apply it. So what did we do here? Well, we decided to dedicate a portion of our state grant funding to purchase additional titles and copies of more diverse books for these early and transitional areas. And this audit has also just really increased my own awareness around the need for diverse representation in future purchases. I've always tried to be mindful in my purchases, but this has really dialed up that awareness and keeps me looking for quality, diverse representation for all of our different collections. It's also really influenced our Reader's Advisory, including our online personalized reading lists, in-person recommendations, displays, formal book lists, and other recommendations by staff. We've really made a push for folks to be mindful of what they're recommending and make sure that they're including diverse books. Lastly, our core collection and grade level reading teams are using not just this particular audit, but also the concept of the audit itself to do their own analysis of portions of the collection in order to raise up more diverse titles in their project areas. And with all of that in mind, I'm going to turn it back over to Amy now to talk about one of those GLR projects, which they're calling the Welcome to Reading Kits.
Thanks, Sarah. I think listening to you talk about all of that again really brought to mind how nice it was to be able to do that audit with a partner and to be able to have these conversations, whether they were by GChat as we like filled out the the tally or email, or we would pick up the phone or visit each other's offices, really being able to have those conversations as we encountered different stories and materials was, I think, really helpful in my learning process.
I totally agree. It really helped me with the collection development.
Yeah. All right, I am going to now jump into Welcome to Reading Kits. Because just about the time we wrapped up our subject heading and audit projects, the GLR team was created, and that was the perfect time to look at increasing ways to support caregivers with developing readers. And Welcome to Reading Kits are the results of months of brainstorming, and I'm super duper excited about them. Before we had the kits, we had this goal. We wanted to make it fun for developing readers and their caregivers to practice reading by providing easy access to excellent, engaging, and diverse books. We also knew that many caregivers were looking for tips and activities to help their new readers because no one teaches a caregiver how to teach their child to read. So we wanted to make it easy for families starting the Learning to Read journey. We decided to create themed kits around the 5 grade level reading skills, and these are skills that our grade level reading project team created because we realized we needed a touchstone to tie all of our work together and to empower our library staff to confidently serve and support kindergartners through 3rd graders in their reading journeys. You might notice that they're similar to Every Child Ready to Read skills, and that's intentional. We really do want this to be the next logical step as kids transition from ready to read to learning to read. So our first skill is decoding. It's our ability to recognize the shape of a letter and match it to an associated sound. We string all those sounds together to pronounce words. When kids sound out words, they're decoding them. And that relationship between the way a letter looks and the way they sound is called phonics. So understanding phonics helps us decode words. Fluency is the ability to read quickly, accurately, and with expression. In other words, effortlessly. Readers who aren't yet fluent will sound slow and choppy when reading out loud. And fluency might change depending on how hard or easy a text is for an individual. And reading books at a lower level can help build that fluency. Comprehension is the ability to understand and or explain what you're reading. And successful readers can identify what they do and don't understand in a text, and then use strategies to problem solve. Background knowledge is helping kids build familiarity with new vocabulary and concepts. Without background knowledge of a word or concept, it's harder for kids to understand what they're reading. For instance, readers who are familiar with soccer will be able to decode and comprehend words like goalie and dribble more successfully than those who have no context for the sport. And finally, we have reading motivation, and this is where public libraries really shine. It's a huge factor in cultivating reading motivation is choice, right? Kids who are allowed and encouraged to choose what they read are much more motivated and more likely to think of themselves as readers. Learning to read takes a lot of practice and brain power, and kids who are excited to read are much more likely to get the practice they need and therefore more likely to develop the necessary focus to become skilled lifelong readers. And as Sarah mentioned earlier with the diversity audit, a big part of reading motivation is seeing yourself reflected in the books that you read. So with our GLR skills in mind, we created 4 themed kits to target very new readers. And in case you're wondering which of the 5 skills we left out, it's reading motivation because it's present in all of the kits. This is an example of our decoding kit. You can see the 5 books. Every kit has at least 1 nonfiction title, as well as at least 1 or more titles with diverse characters. And I'm going to be honest, it's really not easy at all to find excellent books that are also diverse in their representation. We really relied on those diversity audit findings when we were selecting our titles for these kits. In this particular kit, I See a Cat features a dog waiting for their brown skin owner to come home. The activity for this kit is My First Bananagrams. We really contemplated whether or not we should create our own activities from scratch or purchase them, and we ultimately decided to purchase because they would be sturdier that way, and it saved us time. We worked hard to make sure that the tips on that purple tip sheet are as concise as possible. Things like, help your reader hear letter and syllable sounds by asking questions like, do we hear in the word moon? And another tip for this kit is, reading the same words multiple times helps readers enforce neural pathways so they can retain new words. We also include a customer survey for evaluation purposes in each kit. On average, the kits cost about $75, and this includes the bag, activity, and books. We've included that vendor information at the end of our webinar as well. A giant shout out to the awesome library staff at Multnomah County Library in Oregon. They have similar kits that also target new readers, and they were really helpful in sharing photos and info. As I mentioned, this is a pilot project, so we have our 26 locations plus several bookmobiles. We're a very large system, and we just wanted to try this idea out on a smaller scale. We picked 6 locations based on 3rd grade reading scores and the presence or absence of supporting services in the immediate area. The pilot launched in June of this year, and each pilot location has 4 kits, 1 for each of the skills. We have a question about charging for replacement costs or late fees. We don't have any late fees here at the Denver Public Library. We recently went fine-free. We do charge the replacement cost if an item has been checked out. I believe it's more than 42 days past the due date. We actually just had a conversation with our cataloging department on what we should set as the replacement cost, and we decided that it would be just under the amount before people would be sent to collections if their fines got that high. So it's currently $24.50. That's a great question, Sarah. So as always, we've built evaluation methods into this project. Our goal is to have 90% positive responses on those customer feedback surveys and to establish a baseline, and then we'll have a target for circulation goals. This is a screenshot of the data visualizations from our Power BI dashboard. The top one shows total monthly circulation by branch, and the bottom one shows circulation by kit type. And these visualizations automatically update, which is pretty awesome. Big shout out to Monica in our collection development office. She's a Power BI whiz. As of the second week of September, our kits have circulated over 70 times. And in August, most pilot locations circulated 4 to 5 kits, which we feel like is pretty good. Right now, our stats are based on just a few months of circulation, so we still need to gather more data to get a better picture. And we've just changed our kits to be non-renewable. In the past, they could renew up to 3 times. So we expect this to impact turnover for the coming months. The grade level reading project team is working on an expansion request for 2020. Our goal is to expand to a second level of kits for more confident readers, and how much we expand will depend on funding. We put a lot of thought into these kits, especially around selecting titles that would support very new readers, because we want these kits to be a gateway to the rest of the collection, so that once a caregiver realizes that we have books that their child can read successfully, we can then show them to the rest of the collection. But the more we worked on these kits and other GLR projects, the more we realized our beginning reader collection as a whole was not set up in a way that made it easy for caregivers to find books at a supportive level for their individual child.
Yes, so that that challenge of finding those books for the developing readers in any sort of logical way for parents and caregivers is what led us into the beginning reader criteria. So how are we as a library system making the readers available to those on their reading journey? Historically, we've simply placed the beginning readers in one of 4 levels, and we call them JR, R for reader, JR1, JR2, and JR3, based mostly on the level assigned at the publishing house and then roughly eyeballing it for those that aren't leveled by the publisher. We've talked on and off over the years about the frustrations at the inconsistencies within each level and the books that are all lumped in with the readers that do not necessarily support new readers. But each time we got to the point of saying, well, what can we do differently, we would decide it was just an impossible task given external forces and internal lack of staff. In short, we just felt overwhelmed by everything that would have to change in order for us to make things truly accessible. However, recently with the focus on the grade level reading, it seemed like the opportune time to revisit the quandary and try to figure out ways that we could make it better, even if we couldn't make it perfect. So, members of the Denver Public Library grade level reading team invited me to work with them to come up with a rubric for leveling the beginning readers here in-house. We discussed a variety of criteria that we also pulled from some respected sources that were KT Horning's From Cover to Cover and also the Geisel Award criteria. We compiled them together in a rubric representing each of our 4 levels of beginning readers. And here you can see that some of the main criteria, and it changes over the different levels, but in general we're looking for word repetition, sentence length, punctuation, font size, white space, visual context clues, and Lexile. And those again were all things that Amy addressed earlier, and we just want to make sure that things are in the right place. So using those criteria, our colleagues came up with a weighted rubric. We decided to weight the categories since some of them were more critical in terms of contribution to the successful reading experience. We wanted to create a legacy tool, one that would support the current usage and still be relevant to future purchases. Because the person in my position has been the only one assigning levels for all these years, and because this job has changed hands a few times over the last decade, we felt really strongly that we needed to come up with a tool that depended less on who was in this particular role and more on what was in the text of the books in front of them. This is still a very new tool for us, and it's still in beta testing. As I order new books, new readers, I ask the folks in our Technical Access Services department to set them aside for me, and I run each one of them through this rubric to figure out what level it should go at. So far, I think it's working great and has really good potential. The next steps will be for us to work with the cataloging department to decide how we're going to be able to implement this at a wider level. Are we going to be able to retroactively apply this matrix to the collection, to a certain portion of the collection, or is it just going to be used going forward so that within 5 or 10 years we've built a collection that's a little more stable? Time's just going to be what is going to tell us on that. So, how do you all level your own books for developing readers, or do you level them at all? Please use the chat feature and just chat in and let us know. Do you go with those publisher levels? Do you all do it? Does the person in charge of collection development decide those levels? Just let us know. Please share with us.
I have to say, while we're waiting for people to type in their thoughts and what they're doing at their libraries, it's been a really eye-opening experience to have these conversations about them. And this is a great question from Nancy, actually, that segues into that. We have 4 people on our grade level reading team, and then we have Sarah. So right now it's the 5 of us who are talking about these criteria right now. But we've kicked around the idea of having sort of a leveling party or a criteria party where we'd get a bunch of books, invite anybody who wants to come to do that, do a little bit of a training, and then have sort of a professional development kind of situation. Let's see. Jesse sounds like they're having some conversations about similar issues, what to do with leveled books. Holly doesn't level at all. They are all just together in the early reader section. In-betweens are picture books. I'm guessing in-betweens are maybe like chapter books or what we would call transitional. Looks like Sarah doesn't level at all. Just a section for early readers. Diana depends on those publisher levels, yeah. Well, thank you, Emily. We appreciate your kind words. It's been a big project, but it's been pretty eye-opening. Let's see. Early readers tend to be pre-leveled books. Yeah, we did a lot of research on what major publishers are doing for leveling, and it was I was trying to make a chart to see how they all lined up, and I think I broke my brain.
Yes.
They wouldn't line up because they don't. There's so much inconsistency within a publisher's level that it's hard. Debbie levels the books as best that she can based on multiple level scales. Using level 1, level 2, early chapter and picture books.
And this is Christine. I think Nancy makes a good point about not leveling at all because they don't have enough staff. And once again, the wide range of public libraries in the U.S., we have large library districts like Denver Public, and we have, even here in Colorado, we've got staff of maybe 1 or 2 at a library. So I think everybody kind of makes the best decisions that they can moving forward.
Yeah, and we've really tried to see if this criteria of rubric will help us save some time, because we won't have to have a discussion every time a book comes up. That Sarah can be able to run most of them through this system, so each one isn't so time consuming.
All right. So just going to talk about the dilemmas here that we face with these beginning readers in particular. It seems like most of the publishers use the Fountas and Pinnell's guided reading levels to determine which publisher level they're going to place their title in. Many of those publishers might actually be using the same company or person. As Amy was doing some research, she found Marla Khan with Readability Inc. But it's really not clear from the publisher websites which guided reading levels are included in each publisher determined category. So in some cases, it seems like the publisher level stays the same across the whole series. Say Petunia Pig is the same all the way across, even if the reading level within those different Petunia Pig books change. So each publisher seems to have its very own unique system in terms of what eventually gets assigned at each of the levels. Sometimes the publishers will indicate on the back of a book that it falls within a certain range, but none of that is available to me when I'm actually doing the ordering. So we're dealing with inconsistencies in levels not just across the publishers, but also within the same publisher's own levels. Quality is another challenge when considering the publisher levels. Some titles actually aren't really supportive for developing readers. They don't actually line up with those things we talked about earlier. They might have a cluttered background, unfamiliar vocabulary, really long words and sentences, and lack of repetition. We have noticed that this is especially prevalent in commercial tie-in titles. Reading, like collection development, combines art and science. So to come up with exact, well-defined criteria for what goes where is really difficult because there are just so many variables. So I just want to share a few of the conundrums that I face in the collection development office on a daily basis. Many kids do want to read those media tie-ins, but most of them aren't written to be supportive of developing readers, even though they might have a level 1 stamped on the cover. So what do I do with those? And then what about books that are written in a series? I just love the excellent I Like to Read series that Holiday House has published. But there's also things like Corduroy, Paddington, the Biscuit type series. Should all of those stay together in the same level in-house, or should they be broken out into different levels despite what the publishers have printed on their covers? Also, many times a book feels like it could go in 2 different places, and it's really challenging to decide where the best fit would be. Is it a graphic novel or a beginning reader? Is it level 1 or does it just tip over into level 2? Some of you might actually be asking why we bother to level our readers at all. I know just from our discussion earlier that some of you don't, for many reasons, but one of those reasons might be because you feel it's an infringement of intellectual freedom. Others might feel it's imperative to level those books to create more opportunities for easy discoverability. It really is a delicate line that we have to walk in libraries between supporting those that are beginning their reading journey, and also not creating a system that feels demeaning or unsupportive. And as some of you also mentioned, there's just also the sad reality of time constraints. I'm the only children's selector for the entire Denver Public Library system. So it's really difficult for me to find time to touch every book that comes through. Publishers don't make a lot of money on these beginning readers, so they actually don't put a lot of money into the publication of the readers. That means that advanced reader copies are just practically non-existent. So I don't get to see these books ahead of time, and I have to assign their collection on the fly as they come in. I'll be continuing to do this in the future, just as I've always done, but at least now, because of this rubric, I have a tool that seems to be providing some consistency in terms of getting these books that are in a similar reading level all put together, where young readers can discover them and then take those crucial steps along the path to a lifelong love of reading.
So I'm going to come back to this question slide in just a second. I just want to let people know, if you do have to go, because I know we're almost at time, that we really appreciate you joining us. Be sure to sign up for the fourth webinar in our series focused on grade level reading, which is on outreach, and you can go back and watch the others on in archived parts 1 and 2. That we do have sources for further reading, so you can get those brain juices going, and we have those resources for welcome to reading kits and diversity audits. So now I'm just going to go back, see if anybody has any questions. Christine's reminding us that we have that feedback survey, as well as if anybody needs a certificate of attendance. But if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat window. You can also contact us. Be happy to chat more about any of this. We're glad everybody could join us today. And I see Christine typing.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here today and for your participation. It really makes a difference to have that interactive piece of things, just like Christine was talking about at the beginning.
I also want to thank everybody for joining us today. I put the link to the survey both on the screen and in the chat. Both links are live, and if anybody does need a certificate, my email address is there. And I know there was a discussion earlier about some of the tips that they had shared that are still being worked on. And so, Amy, I might have you just pop your email back in the chat if you don't mind, so that if people are interested in some of the tips that might be like ready for prime time, they can contact you. Once again, I want to thank our presenters for all of this really great information. I will have the archive posted hopefully within